Oh, Eddie, Eddie, Eddie. Welcome back to the channel. Eddie Jones, no longer the Australia coach. The saga of the last 9 months is over. And it's all a bit sad, really, but that's what I'm getting into in this video. Put your comment down below. What do you make of it? Who's to blame? And where does the sport of rugby in Australia go from here? But that's what we're going to get into. Make sure you like the video and that you're subscribed to the channel as well. Let's get into it. To me, this whole situation feels a little bit like that cliche of getting back with an ex and then it not working out. In that Eddie Jones took charge of Australia in the early 2000s, got onto a World Cup final, and then by his own admission, he stayed on too long, ended up getting fired, but he returns in a blaze of glory, and they think it's all going to work out. He's going to be the man to lead this team into a home World Cup, into a home British and Irish Lions series, to re-engage the Australian public in the sport once more, and it just doesn't work out. And at the end of that, you're all left kind of looking at it and thinking, well, of course it wasn't going to work out. It almost feels a little bit inevitable. But as I say, I do feel a bit sad about it, really. I'll try my best to explain why. I think there's a fair bit of blame to be passed around, and also a sad reality, which is something I've mentioned on this channel before, of where rugby union is in terms of the position of its standing in the sporting landscape in Australia. But let's get into it then. The first thing I would say is I think this is quite a multi-layered situation. I don't think it is purely a case of putting all the blame on Eddie or all the blame on Rugby Australia. And I think that's probably best exhibited by the comments of the various parties which have come out in the media over the last few days. Any of you that have had a look at it, Eddie Jones has done an interview where he's spoken about it, and he said that the infrastructure and money probably wasn't in place for him to be able to implement what he wanted to implement over the next few years. Whereas Phil Waugh of Rugby Australia has come out and said that he feels like their plans are on track. There seems to just be, for whatever reason, and we never know the full story of what's going on behind the scenes, and I think this is undoubtedly a situation where there will be plenty going on behind the scenes, that, yeah, there'll be lots going on, but it seems like a situation where the two parties aren't particularly aligned. And it brings you on to the question of why not, which is maybe what I'll get onto a little bit later in the video. Given that Eddie Jones returned at the start of the year, it already got to this point where you feel like the two parties are not aligned. The two parties are not in the same place when it comes to looking ahead to where the sport of rugby union is. But anyway, let's get on to Eddie Jones. It is deeper than him, but he does deserve a lot of criticism here. You look at the treatment of some of the older players in that squad, Michael Hooper, Quade Cooper, not even getting a call to find out they weren't in the World Cup squad. And you've got to remember as well that towards the end of his England tenure, it was something which was levelled at Eddie of how he treated players. Plenty of them in the system absolutely loved him. James Haskell, Ben Youngs, a number of other guys. I think there were plenty of others that struggled with him, and I think that's probably going to be the case again here, whether it starts to come out of what the players thought about him. But certainly Quade Cooper wasn't happy. Michael Hooper, you could understand, wouldn't be happy, who, by the way, he's coaching as part of the Barbarians against Wales this weekend. You also look at the coaching turnover, which I think is a worrying trend that we've seen with Eddie Jones' teams, and we've seen it with England. We saw it again with Australia, losing important coaches on the eve of a World Cup. And then you marry that all together and you look at the results. 2 wins in 9 test matches. Those wins coming against Portugal and Georgia, who you would always expect Australia to beat. Defeats, heavy defeats to Wales, the worst performance in a World Cup that we've ever seen from an Australian team. And then the rumours of him interviewing for the Japan job. Now, Eddie Jones denies the fact that he has a job lined up. He thinks it's been a storm that has been created by the media, whereas the journalists in Australia that have first reported and broke that story have said this is absolutely 100% correct. We'll see if he does end up with Japan. And then I think you've got the apathy from the fans. How much did the Australia fans buy into the Eddie Jones project? Some of them probably did, not all of them. And you look at it at the end of the England tenure as well. Do the fans of the teams, the countries that he is coaching, do they believe in him anymore as a coach? You look at the England legacy tarnished by the last few years. The last 9 months with Australia will not have done his reputation any favours whatsoever. So where does this leave Eddie Jones? I don't think he's a terrible coach. I think some of his methods in terms of the way he treats players, I think you could question whether it is suitable for the modern player anymore. This is something we talk about across all sports. Players change, the sensitivity of players changes. You do have to approach them in a different way to perhaps once you did years ago. Is that a fact now? Has he caught up in that regard? I don't really know the answers to that, but I think they are questions worth posing. And it's just a really acrimonious, disappointing, poor situation. But it's not all Eddie Jones. And that brings us on to Rugby Australia. Hamish McLennan and Phil Waugh, the powers that be at the top of the organisation, their decision to sack Dave Rennie and bring in Eddie Jones. And on the one hand, you can look at it. Dave Rennie's results were not great by any stretch of the imagination. Eddie Jones becomes available. You have a British and Irish Lions tour on home soil, a World Cup on home soil, as I point out already. And Eddie Jones is box office, and he will get you headlines. And I can understand them thinking that that would have been a positive thing for the game, needing to capture the headlines and the attention of people in Australia. But you also have to marry that up with results, and that's been the problem. They haven't done that at all. But the worst part of all this now is they blew up a plan they already had. There was a structure in place with Dave Rennie of who would take over after he was decided time was up. Even though the results weren't great, I felt watching Dave Rennie's Australia teams, you felt like they were trying to build and head in the right direction. So they rip all that up, bring in Eddie Jones, and it ends in tears months later. And understandably, there's been calls for Hamish McLennan in particular to resign. He's said that that's the last thing the sport needs, given the important few years that they have coming up. It doesn't need any more turbulence. But then you also look at the win percentage since he came into the role in 2020, I think it was, and it has been rock bottom, absolutely terrible. And there needs to be major questions asked of Rugby Australia as an organisation. But all of this, Eddie Jones, Rugby Australia, it brings us on to the really important point of where rugby is in the Australian sporting landscape. It has massively fallen away to the NRL. The Aussie rules, the AFL is on the rise. Those two sports, I think, are way ahead of it at the moment. And then obviously cricket as well, the national sport, I think is ahead of rugby union. Plus then you throw in basketball in particular, and rugby is in and has been for a little while in a really tough and dangerous place in terms of its future, and getting it back on track is a long-term project. I think it's probably longer than this next 4-year cycle taking them to a home World Cup. That World Cup I think is crucial. I think they have to be in a much better place heading into that. But it goes down to the grassroots. They have Auskick for the AFL, which the AFL's put a lot of money into, and getting young kids into it. And it goes right down to that base level of re-engaging at that amateur level, but wider level. There'll be Australian fans watching who'll have a better idea of me than this, but I think that some of those traditional local clubs are still in a decent place. It's more across the whole of Australia, and capturing everyone's imagination is where it's really, really struggling. So it's a long road ahead. Who replaces Eddie Jones? And what does the sport look like in a few years' time? I want a strong Wallabies team because I think that benefits the whole of the sport. I think you look at the Rugby Championship and it has been affected by the fact that Australia have been weaker in recent years. You look at the sport as a whole, we want as many teams being competitive at the top level as possible. And Australia could be a massive part of that. 2-time World Cup winners. But having said that, it was a couple of decades ago now. So this whole situation, Eddie will get criticised, deservedly so. Rugby Australia will get criticised, deservedly so. But it is bigger than all of that. And what are the answers? If I knew that, I wouldn't be having this YouTube page. I'd be working in rugby administration. I'm not blind to the fact that I'm pointing out a whole load of issues and not necessarily having the answers myself, because they are really complicated. But I hope they're able to figure out some of those answers. As for Eddie, his future, Japan, maybe. What's his future as a coach at the very top level, given what we've seen with England and Australia? I don't think we can really be blamed for questioning whether his time is up. We will wait and see. Let me know what you make of it in the comments section. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel as well. Make sure you like the video. But Eddie Jones leaves the Wallabies. What an acrimonious, disappointing situation that is. I'll see you in the next one.